How do you warn a stranger without killing the man standing next to you? That is the question sitting in front of a Mossad case officer on a night that has no name in any file, only a date and a location, both of which he is forbidden to touch. He is 34 years old, though the passport in his jacket says otherwise. He has lived under this name for 3 years. He has a job at a shipping office, a landlord who likes him, a co-worker who thinks he is quiet because he is shy, not because every sentence he speaks in this language has been rehearsed 1,000 times before it ever left his mouth. 10 minutes ago, his phone rang once. At an hour, it never rings. He answered on the second ring, not the first, because answering too fast is its own kind of confession. The voice on the other end did not waste words. It gave him a place, it gave him a date, then it gave him an order that had nothing to do with stopping either one. Protect the position. Do not intervene. He is sitting at a kitchen table that faces a courtyard instead of a street, because a street means witnesses, and a courtyard means only pigeons. The information in his head right now could change what happens on that date, at that location, to people he has never met and will never be allowed to picture as anything other than a number in a briefing he will not be present for. He is not going to be the one who decides what happens with it. Before we go further, here is something for you, because you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. We put together a limited edition ebook, a collection of real operations where an officer was ordered to protect a network instead of a person, and had to live with what that order actually cost. The silences that were never explained, the faces that stayed strangers on purpose, the nights that never made it into any debrief. These are the cases doctrine never puts a name to. If this is the world you cannot look away from, this book is where it lives. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy, or click the link in the description. Then stay with us, because this story is just getting started. 3 years ago, he was someone else entirely, a name that still exists somewhere in a personnel file he is not allowed to think about. That man had a different accent, different reflexes, different instincts about which side of a street to walk on. That man is gone now, replaced so thoroughly that even his own reactions, the ones that happened before thought, belong to the name on the passport in his jacket. Building that replacement took longer than anyone outside the trade would believe. It took 1,000 small performances that never once looked like a performance. 100 conversations where the goal was not to be interesting, but to be forgettable. Exactly forgettable enough that no one in this city has ever once wondered who he really is. That forgettable version of himself is the only reason the phone rang tonight at all. It is the only reason anyone trusted him close enough to a shipping schedule that eventually touched a plan involving a place and a date he now cannot unknow. 2 risks are sitting across the table from him right now, and neither one is smaller than the other. The first risk belongs to strangers he cannot name and will never see. The second risk belongs to a network he has spent 3 years building himself into one conversation, one shipment log, one carefully forgettable lunch at a time. If he moves even quietly, even through the smallest indirect channel available to him, the access he has built could collapse in a single afternoon. Not just his own cover. Every asset whose safety is quietly, invisibly stitched into the same fabric he is a thread of, in ways he has never been shown and never will be. If he does not move, the date on the calendar arrives exactly as planned, and whatever happens at that location happens without a single word of warning reaching anyone who could have used it. He did not build this network by accident. It took years of small, deliberate nothing, appearing exactly ordinary in 100 rooms until ordinary stopped being a performance and started being armor. That armor is the only reason he was in a position to hear anything worth protecting in the first place, which means the very thing making this warning possible is the same thing that makes delivering it almost unthinkable. There is a phrase officers in his position use privately when they use any phrase at all. They call it the tax. Not the danger, not the fear, something quieter and longer. The tax is what gets paid slowly over years, by the person who has to keep functioning normally in the daylight while carrying something at night that no normal person is built to carry alone. He has not paid that tax yet. Tonight is where the bill starts. There is a third risk he has not let himself look at directly, and it is smaller than the other two but sharper in a different way. Every hour he spends replaying that phone call is an hour where his ordinary face might slip, even slightly, in front of people trained to notice slight things without knowing they are trained at all. A landlord does not need proof. A coworker does not need evidence. All it takes is one flicker of a man who suddenly looks like he is somewhere else, and 3 years of forgettable becomes one night of memorable, which in this line of work is its own kind of ending. He does not know, sitting at this table, whether the decision being made somewhere above his head is the correct one. He is not being asked whether it is correct. He is being asked whether he can live inside it, silently, for as long as it takes, without a single visible crack showing to a landlord who likes him or a coworker who thinks he is only shy. There is a second risk underneath the first two, quieter than either, and it has nothing to do with strangers or networks. It has to do with him. Every officer who has ever sat where he is sitting has learned the same private arithmetic, the one nobody writes down because writing it down would make it real in a way the trade cannot survive. The arithmetic says that knowledge like this does not stay contained to the night you receive it. It moves into you. It changes how you sleep, how you sit in rooms, how you look at ordinary people going about ordinary days without knowing what you know about at least one date on at least one calendar somewhere. He has 3 years of practice being someone else. He has 0 years of practice carrying this particular weight while being someone else, and there is no manual for how those two things sit together inside one body. Outside the window, the courtyard is empty except for the pigeons that own it after dark. Somewhere beyond that courtyard, in a city he has learned to move through like he was born in it, ordinary people are finishing ordinary dinners, completely unaware that a stranger 3 streets away has just been handed information that concerns them and has just been told in 6 words that it is not his to give. He has not decided anything yet. There is nothing for him to decide. The order was not a request. But sitting alone at that table, in the last quiet hour before the machinery of his cover starts moving again in the morning, he allows himself exactly one unguarded question, the kind of question a case officer is not supposed to ask out loud even to himself. If the network survives this and goes on to prevent something larger later, does that make tonight's silence the right call, or does it simply mean the wrong call happened to work? He does not answer it. He will not get to answer it for a very long time, if ever. What he does know, with a certainty that has nothing to do with orders or arithmetic, is that somewhere between tonight and the date circled on a calendar he is not permitted to touch, the ordinary version of himself is going to have to go to work, speak his cover language, eat his cover lunch, and behave in every visible way, like a man who knows nothing at all. The only question left, the one he cannot ask his handlers and cannot answer himself, is how long a person can hold something that heavy behind an ordinary face before something, somewhere, starts to show, and whether anyone will be watching closely enough to notice when it finally does. Morning arrives the way it always does now, which is to say it arrives as a performance he has to remember to begin. He showers, dresses, checks his own reflection the way a man checks a tool before using it, not out of vanity, but out of habit that has kept him alive for 3 years. Nothing on his face gives anything away. That, more than the passport, more than the shipping logs, is the actual proof he is good at this. He had assumed, sitting at that kitchen table the night before, that the hardest part would be the silence itself, carrying the date, carrying the location, saying nothing. He walks into the shipping office believing that, and by mid-morning he learns he was wrong about which part was going to hurt. The hardest part is not staying silent about something he cannot change. The hardest part is discovering, in the space of one overheard sentence between 2 colleagues who have no idea what they are casually discussing, that the location on his calendar is not a stranger's address at all. It is somewhere his landlord's daughter works 2 afternoons a week. He does not react, he cannot afford to react, and 3 years of practice make sure his face does exactly nothing, while something inside him rearranges itself completely. The assumption he walked in with, that this was a clean transaction between strangers he would never have to picture as anything but numbers, collapses in real time, standing at a filing cabinet holding a clipboard he is no longer reading. This changes nothing operationally. That is the part that makes it unbearable rather than merely painful. The order has not changed, the network has not changed. The arithmetic that made sense in a fluorescent room somewhere above his head has not changed 1 decimal point, simply because he now has a face to attach to one possible outcome instead of an abstraction. He finishes his shift. He says goodnight to a landlord who has no idea her daughter's name is now sitting inside a stranger's silence like a splinter. He walks home a different route than usual, not for tradecraft this time, but because he is not entirely sure his own legs are behaving normally, and an unfamiliar street feels safer than a familiar one where anyone might notice a familiar man behaving strangely. There is a hidden cost to this work that no training prepares an officer for, and it is not the cost of exposure, it is the cost of proximity. Distance is what makes the arithmetic survivable. The moment distance disappears, even for one person, even for one afternoon shift at one address, the whole clean structure of protect the position starts to feel less like doctrine and more like something he is personally, physically responsible for. He tries, for a while, to talk himself back into the distance. He tells himself the girl is not the target, only someone who happens to occupy the same coordinates as the target on the same afternoon, which is technically true and helps him for exactly as long as it takes to remember that technically true has never once been the same thing as bearable. He tries to remember her face and cannot, not clearly, only a handful of small, ordinary details. A laugh through a thin apartment wall. A name mentioned once over tea he barely paid attention to at the time. The not knowing her well is supposed to make this easier. It does not. That night, he does something he has never done in 3 years under this name. He considers breaking protocol. Not fully, not recklessly. He is still, underneath everything else happening in his chest, a trained officer, and trained officers do not simply pick up a phone and start talking, but he sits with the number that is not supposed to be used except in genuine emergencies, the one reserved for situations where an asset believes continuation is no longer survivable, either operationally or personally, and he lets his thumb hover over it longer than doctrine would consider comfortable. He does not call. What he does instead is request contact through the correct channel, at the correct hour, and when the voice on the other end answers, it is not the same voice from before. This one is more senior, more careful, the kind of voice that has clearly had this exact conversation with other officers in other kitchens in other cities, and knows precisely how it tends to go. He does not ask to abort the operation, because the operation was never his to abort. What he asks, carefully, in the coded phrasing built for exactly this kind of conversation, is whether the position can be pulled. Whether he, specifically, can be exfiltrated before the date arrives, not because his cover is blown, but because he no longer trusts himself to carry what he is carrying without some kind of visible fracture appearing in front of the wrong person. The answer is not a yes and not a no. It is worse than either. The voice tells him that pulling him now, days before an unrelated but geographically close event, risks drawing exactly the kind of attention his 3 years of forgettable have been built to avoid. A sudden departure. A sudden gap in a shipping office schedule. A landlord suddenly without a quiet tenant. At the precise moment, local security services in the region are likely to be looking harder than usual at anything that shifts unexpectedly. Pulling him to protect his conscience could be the very thing that finally exposes him, the network, and every asset stitched into it. Staying might cost him something internal he is not sure he can name yet. Leaving might cost something external he understands with total clarity. He asks because he has to ask, whether there is any way to warn the location itself without revealing the source. A general alert, routed anonymously, vague enough to protect the pipe but specific enough to matter. The voice does not dismiss the idea outright, which somehow makes it worse than if it had. It tells him such channels exist, that they have been used before, and that they have also failed before, badly, in ways that taught the service exactly why they are used only as an absolute last resort, rather than a comfort measure for an officer in distress. Whether this qualifies as a last resort is apparently not his call to make either. He pushes once more, carefully, phrasing the question in the only way the channel allows, asking whether the decision could at least be revisited by someone with fuller visibility than the officer he is speaking to now. The answer comes back measured, almost gentle, which somehow lands harder than if it had been cold. The decision has already been made by people with exactly that fuller visibility days ago, before his phone ever rang the first time. What he is hearing tonight is not a proposal open to revision. It is a confirmation of something already closed. The conversation ends the way these conversations always end, without a decision he gets to witness. Only an instruction to hold position and await further contact, spoken in a tone that is not unkind, simply final. He sits with the phone in his hand for a long time after the line goes dead, in a room that suddenly feels smaller than it did that morning. What breaks in him that night is not his discipline. His discipline holds, the way it has held for 3 years, the way it will need to keep holding for however many days remain on the calendar he still cannot look at directly. What breaks is something quieter and harder to name, a kind of certainty he did not know he had been relying on until it was gone. He had believed, without ever examining the belief closely, that if the cost of silence ever became unbearable, there would be a door. Not necessarily one he could walk through freely, but a door that existed, that someone above him could open if the weight ever became too much to carry alone. Tonight he learns there is no such door. There is only the position, and the order, and a landlord's daughter whose face he now cannot stop seeing every time he closes his eyes. He lies awake, running the same question in different shapes, trying to find an angle where it resolves into something he can live inside more easily. He does not find one. The arithmetic that made sense in a fluorescent room still makes sense, technically, mathematically, and it still tells him nothing about how he is supposed to walk into that shipping office again tomorrow morning, and let his face do exactly nothing. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, he stops trying to solve it and starts simply trying to survive it, which are not the same task, and he is no longer certain which one his training actually prepared him for. The date on the calendar has not moved, neither has the order. What has moved, permanently and without his consent, is his understanding of what protecting a position actually requires a person to become. He does not know yet whether he is still that person, or whether some smaller, quieter version of him died at that filing cabinet the moment he learned exactly whose afternoon shift he was being asked to protect a silence around. All he knows, lying in the dark with the calendar still uncrossed, is that there is no longer a version of tomorrow where nothing has changed. 2 days before the date, he finds himself standing in the stairwell of his own building, one flight below his landlord's door, holding a bag of oranges he does not remember deciding to buy. He tells himself the oranges are for her, a small gesture, the kind of thing a good tenant does without thinking twice. He climbs the last flight before he lets himself admit that oranges have nothing to do with why his hand is already lifted to knock. His pulse is doing something it has not done in 3 years, not on any street corner, not during any border crossing, not even the night his phone rang at the wrong hour. He has trained his body out of visible fear so thoroughly that he almost does not recognize this feeling for what it is, until he notices his own knuckles have gone pale against the door. She opens the door in an apron dusted with flour, pleased and mildly surprised, and for a moment the whole rehearsed sentence sitting behind his teeth feels possible. Something about her daughter, something about maybe skipping the shift this week, something vague enough to sound like nothing and specific enough to actually matter. He gets as far as saying her daughter's name. Then he stops. The landlord waits, smiling, holding the door, and in the silence that stretches half a second too long, he hears himself say something about oranges instead, about a market stall that had a good price today, about nothing at all. She thanks him, takes the bag, and closes the door, still smiling, completely unaware that a sentence capable of changing everything died in the hallway between his throat and his mouth. He stands there afterward longer than he should, staring at a closed door, understanding for the first time exactly how thin the line is between protecting a position and simply being a coward wearing the language of doctrine. That night he calls the channel again. He does not plan to. His hand moves before the rest of him agrees to it, the way it moved toward the door 2 floors down, and by the time the line connects, he has already crossed further than he meant to. He asks, this time without the careful phrasing doctrine prefers, whether there is truly nothing that can be done, whether the answer from before was final in the way it sounded, or simply final in the way exhausted people sound at the end of a long shift. The voice on the other end is patient in a way that frightens him more than anger would have. It reminds him, gently, that this conversation has already happened, that repeating it does not create new options, only new risk, every additional contact outside the scheduled windows chipping away at the very invisibility his handlers are trying to preserve. He almost says he wants out. The words assemble themselves, fully formed, ready to leave him. A complete sentence requesting extraction regardless of consequence, regardless of the network, regardless of anything except his own inability to keep carrying this the way he has carried everything else for 3 years. He can feel the shape of that sentence sitting on his tongue, closer to spoken than anything he has almost said in this entire assignment. Some other part of him, older than the fear, older than the guilt, holds it there a beat longer, and in that beat he pictures every face stitched invisibly into the same network he would be unraveling with 11 words. He does not know those faces, he has never met them. That is exactly the problem. He does not send them out. He hangs up instead, sits with the phone dark in his hand, and understands that he came closer in that silence than he has come to anything in this entire assignment. Closer than any near miss on a street corner. Closer than any moment where a stranger's eyes lingered on him half a second too long. The danger tonight was never external. It was sitting inside his own chest, 1 sentence away from undoing 3 years in a single phone call. The next morning, he goes looking for reassurance in the only place available to him, which is the shipping office schedule board, updated weekly, pinned beside the coffee machine like it holds nothing more significant than delivery windows and staff rotations. He has never once in 3 years looked at that board hoping to find something. He has only ever read it the way he reads everything in this life, as background noise necessary to maintain the shape of a job he does not actually care about. Today, he stands in front of it far longer than a man checking his own shift would need to, scanning lines that have nothing to do with him, searching for a coincidence he can survive on. He finds what he is looking for almost immediately. A note, handwritten, indicating a shift change for that week at several nearby locations due to a supplier delay affecting weekend deliveries. He reads it twice, then a third time, letting himself build a small fragile bridge between a supplier delay 2 streets away and a schedule he has no actual visibility into, at an address that has nothing to do with shipping at all. He wants it to mean what he needs it to mean. He wants it badly enough that for 1 entire afternoon he lets himself believe it, lets his shoulders drop for the first time in days, lets himself eat lunch without tasting stone in every bite. He even allows himself, briefly, to plan an ordinary evening. Nothing significant, only the outline of a life uninterrupted, a walk without the usual detour, a meal cooked instead of bought. For a handful of hours he is simply a man with a job at a shipping office, and the ease of it frightens him more, in retrospect, than the fear ever did, because it shows him exactly how easily he could be talked into believing whatever lets the weight go. It is not until evening, walking home along his usual unfamiliar route, that the fragile bridge collapses under its own weight. The note on the board was about shipping schedules. It had nothing to do with anyone's daughter, anywhere, on any afternoon. He had taken a coincidence and dressed it up as mercy because mercy was the only thing he could not manufacture for himself any other way. He stops walking for a moment, in the middle of a street that is not his own, and has to physically wait for the collapse to finish before his legs agree to keep moving. There is a specific kind of shame in realizing you built an entire afternoon of peace out of nothing. A shame sharper than fear, because fear at least respects the danger. This had respected nothing. It had simply wanted the weight gone, badly enough to invent a reason. The relief he felt for those few hours becomes in hindsight its own kind of injury. Not because it was foolish, though it was, but because it revealed exactly how desperately some part of him had been waiting for permission to stop carrying this. Any permission, even a false one built from a handwritten note about crates and a supplier delay. He does not tell his handlers about the false start at the door, or the almost extraction request, or the afternoon he spent believing in a coincidence that meant nothing. There is no channel for confessing misjudgment that did not ultimately produce exposure. The trade only wants to hear about mistakes that mattered operationally, and by its own cold accounting, none of his mistakes tonight moved anything at all. He knows better than to believe that fully. Something moved. He can feel it. The way a structure can shift internally long before any crack becomes visible from outside, the way a beam can be quietly failing for weeks before the ceiling ever shows a single line. He spends the rest of that evening doing the only thing left available to him, which is rehearsing. Silently, the ordinary face he will need to wear again tomorrow, and the day after, until the date on the calendar finally arrives and takes the decision out of his hands the way it was always going to. The date arrives before he feels ready for it, though readiness was never really the point. There was never going to be a version of this morning where he woke up prepared for whatever the next several hours would ask of him, only a version where he showed up anyway. He goes to work that morning the way he has gone to work every morning for 3 years, and somewhere in the middle of an ordinary shift, before the operation 2 streets away has even finished unfolding, the consequences of the last 4 days start arriving anyway, quietly, in the wrong order. A coworker notices he has not eaten. A supplier calls twice about an order he was supposed to confirm and did not. Small things, nothing that would flag him to anyone watching casually, but enough that he understands, standing at that same filing cabinet where all of this cracked open, that the fracture from the stairwell and the phone call and the false relief of a handwritten note has already begun showing, in fragments, well before anyone outside this building learns what actually happened at the location he was ordered to protect. He catches himself, twice that morning, reaching for his phone before remembering there is no call to make and no one waiting to take it. The habit of almost reaching for the emergency channel has outlived the moment that created it, which is its own quiet evidence of how close he actually came, closer than doctrine would ever officially acknowledge in any file with his name attached. What happened there does not arrive to him cleanly either. It arrives in pieces, secondhand, through channels that were never designed to comfort him. Some of what he feared came true, some of it did not. The location was not spared, but it was not the worst version of itself either, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything he did or did not say in a hallway 2 floors down from his own apartment. He is given no clean verdict. No one tells him his silence saved anyone, and no one tells him it cost anyone specifically, because the arithmetic that authorized his silence in the first place was never built to produce answers that specific. It was built to produce probabilities, weighed months and years in advance, and probabilities do not know how to comfort a man standing at a filing cabinet, wondering about one particular afternoon shift. He looks for certainty in the days that follow anyway, the way people always do after something like this, and finds only more of the same careful, deliberate vagueness that got him through the last 4 days in the first place. The network, at least by every operational measure his handlers care about, holds. His cover survives. The shipping office notices nothing beyond a distracted employee having an off week, which passes, the way off weeks do, without anyone connecting it to anything larger. In the narrow terms doctrine uses to judge these things, the position was protected exactly as ordered. That is where the strategic consequences begin, and they begin exactly where the personal ones stop being enough to explain anything. Because the network holding intact means the pipe keeps producing. In the months that follow, intelligence moving through the same access he nearly gave up in a hallway 2 floors below his own door contributes to disrupting something considerably larger than what happened on that one date, something that would have cost more lives than the arithmetic in the fluorescent room was ever weighing against in the first place. This is not told to him as comfort. It is simply what the file eventually shows, years later, to people with clearance he will likely never have again once this posting ends. He does not get to feel good about that. That is the part rarely captured in briefings written after the fact. The math working out, over a long enough timeline, does not retroactively soften the 4 days he spent standing in stairwells holding oranges he did not need, or the sentence he almost spoke into a phone that would have unraveled everything to save one person he barely knew. There is also no version of the file that credits him for what he almost did instead of what he actually did. The near abort, the hallway confession that never left his mouth, the afternoon spent believing a lie about a supplier delay, none of it registers anywhere except inside him. Doctrine has no column for restraint that was never tested by an actual leak. It only measures outcomes, and by that measure alone, his 4 days of quiet unraveling simply never happened. Institutionally, the case becomes something closer to doctrine than incident. Officers after him are trained, in the abstract, on exactly this kind of pressure point, the moment where proximity threatens to override protocol, the moment where an asset's own conscience becomes the single greatest operational risk in the room. His name does not appear anywhere in that training. His specific stairwell, his specific hallway, his specific almost spoken sentence, all of it gets filed down into a general principle taught to strangers who will never know whose 4 days built it. Personally, something in him does not fully recover. Not in a way that shows up on any psychological evaluation designed to catch operators who are no longer fit to continue. He continues. He functions. He remains, by every visible measure, exactly the forgettable man he spent 3 years building. But somewhere underneath that forgettable surface, a very specific kind of doubt takes up permanent residence. The doubt of a man who once came within one sentence of undoing everything, and never fully learns whether not saying that sentence was courage, obedience, or simply fear, wearing the uniform of both. He sees the landlord occasionally, after that week, in the stairwell, at the door, exchanging the same small pleasantries as before. She never learns what almost happened between them at her own doorway, and he never tells her. And that silence becomes its own small, permanent weight added to all the others. One more thing he carries that will never appear in any file, debrief, or conversation for the rest of his posting. What the operation cost him was never the network, and it was never the mission. What it cost him was the quiet certainty, the kind every officer needs to keep functioning. That doctrine and conscience will always eventually point the same direction if you just hold the line long enough. He learned, in one stairwell, that sometimes they do not, and that the not knowing which one was right does not end when the operation does. This case did not happen in isolation. It sits inside a much older doctrine that Mossad has relied on for decades, the doctrine of the long legend. The deep cover identity built over years specifically so that when a moment like this one arrives, the asset has already been trained, quietly and invisibly, to choose the position over the person standing in front of them. Most of the cases that shaped that doctrine never made it into any public file. Some of them, the ones with names and outcomes attached, are laid out in the operational record we put together in the description below. It walks through how deep cover identities are actually built and maintained across years, the specific moments officers have faced this exact fracture point, and what happened afterward to the people, the networks, and the doctrine itself when the choice went one way instead of the other. It is in the ebook linked in the description if you want the fuller record behind stories like this one. If you have made it this far, we would like to know what you would have done in that stairwell. Leave it in the comments below,